And we're real fortunate to have Angela Russell with us today from CUNA Mutual. Um, you know, I the DEI that she's going to talk to us about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is, for me anyway, given the demographics of our state, not something that just jumps to the forefront of my mind all the time, but that doesn't make it any less important for all of us running credit union operations to have a focus on. So I'm real glad that you all joined us today. And like I said, we're very fortunate to have Angela with us. Let me give you a little bit of background about Angela in case you haven't run across her name before. In a former life, this is reaching back into the archives a little bit, she was an epidemiologist, and then also worked in state government for a while and was a policy advisor to the governor of Wisconsin at one point in time. Has held a number of roles in public health, but most importantly for our purposes here today is Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at CUNA Mutual, where she's responsible for leading development and direction, everything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts by CUNA Mutual, both internally and externally. And so, again, we're really fortunate to have you with us today, Angela, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Whenever I hear, thanks for the intro, Joe. Whenever I hear my background, I just kind of cringe a little bit because I sound like a super nerd. And my kids would say that you don't just sound like a super nerd, you are. So,
Well, do you want me to read some more? Because I can.
no, because it's just going to sound worse.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here, and then we can
Awesome.
go from there. All right, let me know when you can see it. Can you all see it?
We do.
All right, so I just want to start off just tossing out a question for the group in terms of when you hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do you think about? What comes to mind for you?
Hi, this is Yvonne from VSECU. Thank you
Hi.
so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I'll start. To me, it makes me think of acceptance of difference.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And yeah, that's what it makes me think of.
Great. Thank you. Who else?
Hi, this is Donna Perquette from Vermont Federal, and I am too. I'm really pleased that you're here. It's one of my favorite topics. And to me, it really just means welcoming everyone to the table where they can be their best authentic selves.
I don't need to give this presentation. Clearly, y'all got this. That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, well, I'm gonna just keep us going here. And so whoopsie, I don't know why I just switched my slides. I did not mean to do that.
And if I can interject for 1 minute,
Yes.
Angela, I want to remind
Yes.
everyone we do have a chat box feature on, it should be on the right hand side of your screen. And if it doesn't appear there, just click on the little chat icon at the bottom of this window that you're looking at. And just, I'll monitor whatever people put in there. We'll make sure to get those questions or comments or whatever you put shared with you, Angela.
Great,
So,
thanks,
and
Joe.
ask questions anytime.
Great. So here are the things that I'm gonna chat about this afternoon. Number one, I'll do a general DEI review. We'll talk a little bit about what does it mean to do DEI during a pandemic, moving forward together, and learning from each other. I will also give a caveat is that I have a couple of kiddos in the house, an 11-year-old who's almost 12 and a 10-year-old. My 11-year-old essentially locks himself in his room every day, so you will not see him, but I would put money on it that will see my daughter pop in at some point during the presentation. So I just wanted to let y'all know that right now. So DEI, what is DEI and why is it important? I'm going to define it and then go into why is it important in a little bit. But DEI is just the wide range of differences that exist among people. There are visible forms of diversity and invisible forms of diversity. So when you think of some of the visible forms of diversity, what comes to mind for you all? You can just shout them out.
Okay, sexual orientation, race, religion, financial status.
So
Gender.
yes, so race and gender often are visible. Sexual orientation is mostly invisible form of diversity, as is financial background. So when we think of diversity, what we're thinking about is the wide range of differences that exist among people, both the differences you can see and some of the less visible characteristics of diversity. And inclusion is creating a work environment where everyone can participate and is valued regardless of that difference. Sometimes we get inclusion a little confused because inclusion isn't creating an environment where people have to conform to the social norms of the majority. It's creating an environment where difference is valued and people can be themselves. There's this quote that I like from Vernee Myers, and Vernee Myers is currently the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for Netflix. And she says that oftentimes when folks are doing inclusion work, they want the whitest Black person, the most male female, and the straightest appearing gay person. That's not inclusion. That's asking folks to assimilate. So when we're working to create inclusive environments, we're creating environments where people can thrive and be their most authentic selves. And then here's a term that we use a lot at CUNA Mutual Group, and that's really focusing on the difference between equality and equity. As Joe mentioned in my background, most of my background is with government. And in government, we have this phrase of we wanted to treat everyone the same. Everyone was equal in our eyes. But you see in this model of equality, when we treat everyone the same, we're focused on equality of input as opposed to equality of outcome. In an equity model, we're giving folks what they need to ensure an equal outcome. So in an equity model, in this particular model, you've got a redistribution of resources to ensure that people have access to that equal outcome, which is C in the game in the scenario. What are other ways that you can get to an equal outcome? You could just name ideas that you have.
Maybe people need more training.
How about in this model?
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. What are other ways that you can ensure equal outcome? So
Take
one
the
way,
fence down.
yeah, take the fence down. Absolutely. What else what other thoughts are there?
Give support to people who need an extra box.
Yep, absolutely. And you can have the shorter person stand on the shoulders of the taller person, and that requires trust between both. What else? You can get tickets to the game. So making sure that people have access to those tickets to the game in the first place. So what I wanted to emphasize here is that equality is often what we talk about, but let's not focus on equality of input. Let's make sure that people have access to receive an equal outcome. Does that make sense to folks?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna keep moving here. So there are some common themes and general best practices, emerging best practices in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Number one is the need to have a high level of support. So I've done this type of work in other organizations, and when you don't have the leader of your organization bought in, it doesn't really go anywhere. So at CUNA Mutual, I'm happy that we have Bob Trunzo kind of leading the charge for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in fact, one of the very first things that he did when he became CEO was add inclusion as a corporate value. The second kind of common theme in emerging best practice is having a long-term commitment. So the differences that we see in our workplaces and in our communities and the disparities didn't happen overnight. So we have to be committed to this for the long haul in order to make sure that we are creating a space where everyone can thrive. Another common theme and emerging best practice is the creation of employee resource groups, affinity resource groups, or business resource networks. These are all the same thing, but variations on a theme in terms of what we call them. And it's people with similar backgrounds getting together in the workplace, getting together to talk about both challenges and opportunities and how to grow within your particular organization. So at CUNA Mutual, we have 13 different ERGs. I don't recommend starting there. We certainly didn't start there. But some of our ERGs include our Veterans ERG, our LGBTQ ERG, our Women in Leadership, our Women in Technology. We've got one for African American folks, one for Latinx folks and Asian American professionals. And it's just really a group where people who have similar backgrounds can connect with each other in real ways. And that creates a sense of inclusion and community in the workforce. Training is also a very, very important aspect of the work of DEI. So making sure that your workforce understands the basics of DEI and has the skills to be an inclusive employee. Another best practice is asking the question, and we call it at CUNA Mutual Group, the equity question of who's benefiting and who's burdened from this particular decision. An example that comes up, well, pre-pandemic was around dress code. Who's benefiting from the items that we have in the dress code and who's being burdened, who's being more restricted. And oftentimes at CUNA Mutual, it was women who were being more restricted in what they could wear versus men. But we actually had to analyze the dress codes through an equity lens for us to actually begin to realize that. Collection of data in terms of best practices is really important, both qualitative data, the stories that you hear both from your members and your workforce, and the quantitative data. Collaboration and alignment with other efforts is also key. We know that organizations, CUNA Mutual included, and credit unions all across the country are wanting to work on DEI, and they should not feel like they're alone in this effort. There is a new organization, or a loosely affiliated organization, that was just created called the DEI Collective. And if you search CU DEI Collective, you'll find a bunch of organizations within the credit union space that are publicly committing to working on DEI. And it's a good way to get connected with others in the credit union space so you can learn and align with other groups. And then because we know that the work of DEI takes a long time and it takes a long-term commitment, recognition of early wins is important, because it's going to be really easy to kind of get sideways or get less motivated to do the work when you mess up, because messing up is part of the learning process. So recognizing when you win. And I will also add, when you mess up, because it's going to happen, recognize that, apologize, and move forward. I want to pause here to see if there are any themes or best practices that you all have questions about.
So not a response to that question, Angela, but just a quick comment. When you reference the DEI Collective, you go to that website and you'll see Association of Vermont Credit Unions listed on there, along with a handful of other leagues that have started to join that organization for hopefully mutual benefit going forward.
Yes, that's great.
Angela, quick question on your ERG.
Yes.
The groups. How does CUNA Mutual decide when to add an ERG?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's mostly, it comes from the grassroots. It's not us within the DEI team dictating which group should exist. Generally, there's a group of employees that say, hey, we'd like to form this group. We think it would be helpful to the enterprise, meaning CUNA Mutual at large, and then we assess whether that's accurate or not. There are some groups that we've said no to because it doesn't move us along the path of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But then there's a lot of groups that we've said yes to. So an example of a group that we said no to, a few years ago, there was a group of employees that wanted to create a Badger ERG for anyone who graduated from the University of Wisconsin. That doesn't necessarily move us along the DEI path. It sounds like a great group. I'm a graduate of UW Wisconsin, but that sounds like a club as opposed to something that would help pursue the inclusion agenda more.
Okay, thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Any other questions? All right, if not, I'm going to keep us moving forward. So I don't know if you've noticed that 2020 is kind of a hot mess. that, that's what I think of it as. I was just talking with some colleagues this morning. I'm like, we all need T-shirts that said, "I survived 2020," and on the mess, 2020 is on the back of 2020 is a hot mess. It's been a kind of, you know, you never know what's coming next in this year. I'm still trying to convince my 12-year-old, my almost 12-year-old, that the world is not ending. My buddy is going through a big change, and during transformation, things get hard, but it's not ending. So the question becomes, how do you continue the work of DEI during the year 2020, during a pandemic, during an economic recession, and during a moment of a civil rights movement? So there are three things that I think we all kind of need to continue to focus in on. That's our members, our workforce, and our community. And recognize that the folks in each one of these groups is being impacted by everything that's going on across the nation. And we know, particularly as it relates to the pandemic itself, that there are, and the economic recession, that there are disparate impacts. And I wanted to talk a little bit about those disparate impacts right now. So in terms of disparate impacts for coronavirus, we know that more men are dying of coronavirus at this point. There's differences in testing rates. We know that communities of color, Black and Latinx communities, are being particularly hard hit because of existing health and economic disparities. We also know, and we've seen it in Madison and also across the nation, calls regarding domestic violence are increasing. Xenophobia against Asian and Asian Americans are increasing. Parents juggling work and parenting, I will add that to the hot mess category. So the impacts of coronavirus, the economic recession, and the civil rights movement are just, it's a trifecta to impact so many people differently. I just want to take another moment to pause and hear from you all. What are you seeing and hearing in terms of the impact of 2020 on your members and on your workforce?
I think that it's hitting different economic backgrounds differently.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. What else are you all seeing?
You know, a lot of these kinds of things that you have listed in your slide, Angela. One observation I have is that there's it seems like, you know, a lot of these things somebody or other tries to tie back to politics in one way or another. People's political beliefs, you know, whichever way they go, you know, will skew some of these things, either amplify them or minimize them, or whichever it is.
Yeah. The divide is huge right now. And what happens, in my own opinion, is that I think we forget to see each other's humanity. We forget how to listen to each other, to learn and connect. We're in this space where we all are listening to react rather than listening to engage in real ways. And I think that listening and that practicing that empathy muscle is going to be critical for all of us as leaders to continue to help our workforce, our communities, and our members. Thank you for adding that, Joe. Anything else that you all are hearing and seeing in terms of impacts of 2020? Right.
Hi, this is Simeon Chapin from VSECU. Just, I'm not on video,
Hi.
so just saying, I think it's embedded in some of the points that you have on your slide, but the difference in how it affects hourly wage workers versus salaried wage workers in terms of flexibility with work schedules. It's embedded in all those, but it's a kind of separate layer that I'm seeing, at least.
Yes, that's huge. It's absolutely huge. Thank you, Simeon, for pointing that out. It's a big deal. And it's also, I mean, it shows up in terms of some of the health disparities by race that we're seeing too, because you often have Black and Latinx folks in the front lines in a lot of lower wage frontline jobs too, across the nation. So we're in an interesting place. And I think that credit unions are really at an important juncture. And I think of my friend has gave me this phrase. I think credit unions can be a very powerful sheltering tree, both for their workforce and their members, in terms of creating a space to connect and help in really real ways during this year. So I'm just going to move forward and talk briefly about, I think of this as an onion. There are things that you can do at an individual level. There are things that you can do at your team level and at your organization level to really begin to move the dial on DEI. At an individual level, really understanding what your North Star is and what you want your personal commitment to be around DEI. The other really critical thing around what you can do as an individual is really understanding your own unconscious biases. So we all have unconscious biases, and it's the way that our brain is wired in the back of our head, and our unconscious biases often drive our behavior more so than our explicit biases. So I use the example in Madison. So in Madison, Wisconsin, we're a very progressive liberal city. We think that we love everybody, everyone's our best friend, yada, yada, yada. If we really truly did love everybody, like we say on an explicit level, we wouldn't see the kind of racial disparities that we see in our community. So that means that there's something going on in the unconscious that's driving our behavior, that's getting embedded into our policies and practices on a day-to-day basis. There is a relatively easy tool that folks can use to uncover some of their unconscious biases. And it's a tool that was created by Harvard. And if you Google Project Implicit, you can uncover your unconscious biases on a whole variety of things, including race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, weight, ability status, a whole variety of things. And be prepared to get your results, and be prepared to be kind of not happy with them. And one of the things that I emphasize before folks take the assessment is realize that it's not a character assessment. It is what's literally going on in the back of your brain. When I first started taking the assessments, because it's free, you can do it in 15 minutes online, 6-7 years ago, a while ago, I would take these assessments and they would come back and tell me that I had an automatic preference. This is going on in my unconscious bias and unconscious mind, that an automatic preference for white folks in America. And I had no idea. But of course, because that's kind of the way the systems and society has been set up to a certain degree. So it's when you realize the unconscious and how that drives some of your behavior, that's when you can create conditions to slow down and figure out ways to check your own biases. Another one that I was shocked that I had is an unconscious bias of preferring men in the workforce as opposed to women. I had this thing that women apparently need to be at home and more domestic, and it was men who are in the workforce. And again, that was surprising to me because I'm a single mom that works. I had no idea that I had this automatic preference that was going on in the back of my head. But it's important for me to know, so I know, and I can create checks and balances within the way I operate, to how am I checking my own biases. So for me, when I'm doing work and I think that I may be strongly biased on something, I ask people, what am I not seeing in this particular decision? Can you poke holes in this? So that's a really important thing that each one of us can do. Your team, you can create a commitment around reading an article and watching a video regularly to get training to create a much more inclusive workplace. And then at your organizational level, you can create a DEI statement to say, this is what we're committed to do, and figuring out ways to listen to your members. I'm sure you're already doing that, but listen to your members from a lens of diversity to see what the differences in needs are by different demographic category, whether it's race, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, a variety of things that you can begin to stratify and look at your data by. Any questions? I was just talking a lot there.
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
You said to Google process something.
Project Implicit.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions on this particular piece? All right, I'm going to keep going. And so what can we do? Number one is intentionality is important. So one of the things that gives me a little pause these days is that I see a lot of folks coming out with a statement as it relates to DEI, which I think is great, but it needs to be a statement and be intentional about what you are going to do beyond doing a statement. Telling your story of why you're personally committed to DEI and understanding your member's story, understanding and embracing difference, and then really asking the equity question in terms of who's benefiting from this decision and who's being burdened. One of the examples that I like to use is related to ADA. A few years ago, again, pre-coronavirus, when we were still all in our workplaces, we had an intern who was in a motorized wheelchair. And my colleague and I had done a presentation on DEI, and the intern's like, "Can I show you something?" And we're like, "Sure." So we could get into the main CUNA Mutual building just fine. But to get into any of the offices, you have to open a door. But he couldn't open a door because there was no push button accessibility. So he had to take an elevator down to come back up to get to the main floor, or take an elevator up and then come back down. And so when I asked facilities, what is this? Why isn't there a push button accessible button on the main floor to allow folks who have different kinds of abilities to get in? Their response was, we did what was ADA compliant. And that was my aha and learning moment, that compliance does not always mean inclusion. So what does being an inclusive workplace look like beyond compliance? And then one way that we can learn that is by reaching out to people who are different than us. I would have never ever known that had our intern our intern didn't have the courage to show us and really kind of make it very clear that we were not being as inclusive as we needed to be. And then in our next little conversation, I want us to have some time to kind of share and learn from each other. One of my very core values is that everyone has wisdom to share. And I think that there's a lot of learning that we can learn from each other in this space. So I'm curious, I want you to take a minute or so to think about, what are you doing related to DEI in your organization? How are you continuing to understand and embrace difference? And how is 2020 impacting your members, your workforce, and your communities? So I'd love for you to take a few minutes, and not a few minutes, a few moments to think through this. And then I'd love to have 3 volunteers kind of share their thoughts. I'm going to mute myself while we're taking a few minutes or a few moments. All right. Anyone want to share? Any brave volunteers out there?
We're currently working with a consultant to help us create a program for going forward. I've also made it very clear to my staff that this is important to us and that this is the direction we're taking going forward. We got the GLIB schedule and looking at that and just kind of working in that direction.
Great. Thanks, Jane. 2 more volunteers to share.
Hi, Angela. This is Yvonne.
Hi.
I guess I'll show some vulnerability and share. I think we're just on the beginning path of this journey. Within our organization, we have talked about fostering an inclusive environment and an accepting environment for years. we know what it looks like. We think we know what it should look like, and we know when we're seeing something that might be inappropriate or isn't right, but we haven't really gotten our arms around formalizing a process or an environment that helps people learn and grow. I think we probably about 1.5 years ago, we really started focusing on gender difference thinking within our organization. I'm the one that really brought it to the forefront of our organization. Our industry is very male dominated, very white male dominated. And in my 25 years of being in this industry, I have spoken to many females of different race and color, the challenge of just being a woman. So when I started to bring gender difference thinking to the forefront of my colleagues, I do think that might have just opened the door a little bit, even though it was very uncomfortable, because at the time I worked solely with 4 men, and I think actually it frightened them a little bit when I started having this conversation. But now fast forward to where we are today, when we're looking at a society that is talking about marginalizing so many different kinds of people, whether it's gender or color or socioeconomic status. So I do think that work that we tried to catapult forward 1.5 years ago, even though it may have stalled a little bit, I actually think that it has prepared us for this very moment in time today. And so, like Jean, we are looking for outside experts or people or individuals who have more experience in data gathering, trying to understand where we are today, what is the benchmark, what are the mindsets, what are those unconscious biases that exist today within our workforce, and then how does that unintentionally create certain behaviors in our workforce. But also when we think about serving our members, how does that unconscious bias unintentionally create hardship and obstacles for our members to overcome through, product development or program access. So like Jean, we're just starting this journey, but I feel like our organization is prepared to be open-minded about it. And I think we're all in a place of acceptance in terms of being uncomfortable and getting comfortable being uncomfortable, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that, Yvonne. Anyone else? One more example. All right, I'm going to keep us moving forward, and then there'll be some more time for Q&A if you have questions for me. So I love Brene Brown. We have an intern right now who works with us, and he's like, "Who's Brene Brown?" And I nearly passed out. I'm like, "What?" But I think she has a wonderful podcast out right now, and I love this quote, and I think it's really timely. And what she says is that this pandemic experience is a massive experiment in collective vulnerability. We can be our worst selves when we're afraid, or our very best, bravest selves. In the context of fear and vulnerability, there is often very little in between, because when we are uncertain and afraid, our default is self-protection. We don't have to be scary when we're scared. Let's choose awkward, brave, and kind, and let's choose each other. So I think in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, it is always awkward. I think that I'm in the right profession because I've been awkward since I was a baby. So I'm comfortable with that discomfort or that awkwardness. And I think this space of where we're at in 2020 with the pandemic, the civil rights movement, and the recession is calling on us leaders to be brave and kind and lean into that discomfort so we can learn together. So that's kind of the final thought that I wanted to leave you all with. And just know that there are other spaces to connect. The CU DEI Collective is going to be a really important and useful tool. And with that, I'm open to any types of questions that you all have, questions or thoughts.
So we have a comment or a question in the chat box, Angela. Simeon was asking, what rights, responsibilities, and support do affinity groups have from CUNA Mutual or other credit union examples? And kind of along with that, there was a question that was crossing my mind while you were talking that is probably only specific to CUNA Mutual. I don't think this affects any Vermont credit unions, as far as I know anyway. And that's the role, with the many employees CUNA Mutual has. I know there's some that are union members, I believe. And so kind of in line with Simeon's question, I was wondering, what impact does having unionized employees have on your DEI efforts? Does it in some ways simplify it because you have limitations as an employer of what you can and can't do, or does it far complicate it and make it more challenging?
Actually, from the DEI perspective, neither. We just have to be mindful of how we're operating things and to be inclusive in a way that's appropriate. In terms of our employee resource groups, each employee resource group receives a budget from CUNA Mutual each year, and the budget is $2,000 per year. But before you become an ERG or before an ERG is official, they have to create an ERG charter that's approved by both our lead for ERGs on our DEI team and lots of times our attorneys, just to make sure that it's within the scope of who we are as an organization and that we're not creating unnecessary risk both for the organization and the participants of the ERG as well. I think one of the most interesting things for ERGs hasn't been the union representation, but the notion of contract workforce. So we have a lot of contract employees at CUNA Mutual Group, and our ERGs are now called engagement resource groups instead of employee resource groups because we had a lot of contract folks that wanted to join them. And when we had contract folks wanting to join, when it was called an employee resource group, it created a potential issue of co-employment type risks.
Thank you. Other questions, folks? Or comments? Just looking at the mix of folks on that we've got connected here and knowing some of the credit unions as I do. So let me paint a picture for you in, small number of credit unions in Vermont, but still true in Vermont as it is in rural Wisconsin and in Montana and the Dakotas and so on and so forth. You have a lot of small credit unions, right? In very rural areas. So let's say you've got a credit union, whatever you consider to be small, and its employee mix is, a handful to 10 employees, half a dozen to 10 employees, or something like that. And it's in a rural town. All the employees, let's say, are female. They're all, probably in Vermont anyway, and probably true in Minnesota and places like that, white. And let's say the majority of them are all moms with kids of varying ages from grammar school up through high school or even college or whatnot. How do you bring DEI down to make it, what you do? What would you advise the people running those credit unions to make this issue real?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Number one, thanks for that question, Joe. That's really an important question. Number one is really understanding what diversity is and going back to that definition of diversity is really just the broad range of differences. And there could be a lot of forms of diversity, and understanding the variety of forms of diversity within your workforce and in your communities is going to be really important. One of the ERGs that I didn't mention that I know has been really helpful for a lot of folks is it's called Modern Family ERG, but it started off what it is essentially is our single working parents ERG. So parents who are going through a split or who are already divorced and co-parenting. And that's my situation. I don't participate in the ERG, but there are some unique challenges that folks in that space have. So how can you get together and talk about those unique challenges and create a space to connect? Another ERG that was just launched at the end of last year is called the Caregiver Network, because we know that a number of our employees are caring for an elderly parent or a sick child or a sick partner. So how can those employees get together in a real way and figure out ways to support each other? And one more that we just launched back again, I think here comes my daughter, back at the end of last year. Oh, that's my son. Hold on. Okay. All right. All right. See you later, buddy. Sorry. It's the Modern Family ERG.
You have a built-in ERG in your house.
I do. The belief network. So we know we have a variety of different faith beliefs in our organization. So how can we create an inclusive space where people from a variety of backgrounds, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and atheist and agnostic, how can folks get together with that diversity of beliefs and still have really robust conversations? And each one of these ERGs has been really powerful because we as a DEI team can't pretend to know all the things about all forms of diversity. So those ERGs help us learn about things that we need to be doing across the enterprise and to lift up those forms of diversity. So there's a question in here of what would you suggest as a first step in terms of starting on an improved DEI journey? So that's a great question. I'm gonna name off a list of resources, and this is where my nerdiness shows a little bit more. So number one, I think having folks really understand the history of the financial services industry in terms of discrimination. So a foundational video that we use at CUNA Mutual Group is called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And it's part 3, it's the video 3 called The House We Live In. So that's I can type that in really quickly. Race, the power of, can you all see this when I type it in?
I think when you hit enter, we will.
Okay. Illusion of the house we live. So that I would recommend. I recommend the book Deep Diversity by an author named Shaquille Chaudhry. I'll just type the name of the book, Deep Diversity. And then the other thing that I recommend, especially for folks that are just starting, is it's a book by Brene Myers called What If I Say the Wrong Thing? Because I think that notion of saying the wrong thing gets folks very paralyzed and in a fear space. So that is good. And then after you kind of gonna get a little bit of background in terms of what all of this means, then starting to say, what will diversity mean for my particular organization? And what will my North Star for diversity be? And then kind of going from there. I think doing it in a group of folks as opposed to just by yourself is really important. So if there's a group of 5 folks at your credit union that kind of want to get this started, I think that that's a good way to start.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
I had a question. This is around engagement from other leadership. Absent, you said leadership is essential to DEI, and having your CEO on board is a key piece.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at kind of foundational documents, statements, board-approved statements, mission statements, et cetera, things like that. If a credit union doesn't currently have a document like that in place, but aspires to,
Mm-hmm.
Do you have examples of pathways that those documents can be done, and this would of course include members of board pathways to truly.
Yeah, I don't have specific examples for credit unions, but I do know that a number of credit unions are working on getting their boards engaged in the diversity and getting their boards to buy in. So I think if you go to CUNA instead of CUNA Mutual, they may know of some organizations that may have some credit unions that may have examples. I don't have specific examples, unfortunately. What we've done at CUNA Mutual Group is that we kind of plowed ahead and then presented to our board a couple years later saying, hey, this is what we're doing. I think having board buy-in probably ahead of that would probably be a better approach.
Other commentary, folks?
Well, you all were lucky. You got to see the rare appearance of my son, even though if you couldn't see him completely, that generally doesn't happen. So consider yourselves lucky.
People see that like once every 7 years or so, right?
Exactly. All righty. Well, thank you, Joe, so much for having me, and feel free to reach out if you all have any questions.
Thank you so much, Angela, for being part of our discussion this afternoon. And thank you, everybody else, for being on the line with us. We don't really have any updates from the states or anything today to share with you that are new, but watch for an update coming out in the next couple of days where we'll give you some other COVID-related updates, and we'll schedule another one of these for next Monday. Thank you. Hope you have a great rest of your week.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Joe.